This is another episode of the Masters of Beautiful Achievements. What can we learn from them on how they apply natural science, systems thinking, and personal leadership to realize these beautiful achievements? My name is Alexander Princeton, and great you are listening to this episode. If you're looking for more inspiring episodes, check out my website, mastersofbeautifullachievements.com. The link can be found here below. These conversations are made possible by our Patreon and Gumtree community, so I want to thank each of you for your monthly or even your one-time support. Your contributions enables me to create these amazing conversations, so thank you for your support. When you're not a member yet, click on the links below to join and be part of this amazing community. If you're interested in how I can help your business create beautiful achievements, choose one of my Gumtree offers on how you want to engage with me, or contact me directly via Scope Matters website. And now, it is time to enjoy the conversation with today's masters. Today I'm sitting here together with Tom Bosschaert. He is founder of Accept. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And today we're going to have a conversation about systems thinking, natural science, innovation, landscaping, basically the whole broad area of design and how to integrate innovations together and how you can put that into practice and also how you can turn it into reality. Basically, that is Tom's business since he started his business 25 years ago. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Could you explain a little bit to us what is your background and what your company is currently doing?
My background. I grew up in the Netherlands. I'm Dutch. I don't feel Dutch, but I am. I was a nerd that would go into the library and read the popular National Geographic and science magazines. Was adored by science from a young age, science and technology, I should say, which led me to go and study industrial design engineering at Delft University, which came as close to being the degree you can get if you want to be an inventor.
Okay.
Yeah. And I very much enjoyed that because it tickles a wide variety of areas of the brain. It has ergonomics, it has marketing, it has construction engineering, it has material science, it has creative design, drawing, presentation, programming, all of those things. And that felt very home to me. As I would say later on in life, I define myself as a specialist generalist. I was already a bit of an entrepreneur at a young age. At 13, I had my first little companies that did a wide variety of things, from making t-shirts to I was the first one in the region where I was living to buy a CD burner.
Oh, really?
And this was not entirely legal. No one's listening to that, of course. But I was selling CDs on the playground of my high school. And
normally we would tape them.
Yes, exactly. But that was CDs. But it was also software actually already at that time. So you would buy software CDs. And it taught me that being an entrepreneur and making money is nothing to be afraid of, which is also something my parents showed me. We were both entrepreneurs. And so when I encountered in my studies that I wanted to try to make the world a better place using invention and innovation, that when I looked around which companies are actually really doing that, I didn't really find one. And so I thought, well, then I might as well start my own. So that's why when I was 19, I founded Accept Integrated Sustainability. And I've been doing that now for 25 years. I went to the US to study architecture and urban planning at Yale.
Why did you do that?
Well, after my degree of industrial design, I knew that I wasn't done learning in a professional environment, and I wanted to learn more about philosophy, theory, and history.
Yes,
which are things that at the Technical University in Delft are not absent. But the most inspiring teacher I had at Delft was my arts history teacher, Timo de Rijk, who's now the director of the Design Museum in Den Bosch, who's an amazing and inspiring individual to me. But I wanted to dive more into that side of things, the sociological side, the ethics, that sort of thing. And I found a home at Yale University that does teach architecture and urban planning, but from that angle.
Okay.
Kind of simplified, but yes. And so I went there. And afterwards, I made the conscious decision to return back to the Netherlands and not stay in the US. Because I thought that my ideas on trying to make the world a better place and working in teams of various disciplines to really move the needle of making significant impact would find a very fertile soil in the Netherlands. I didn't know that I was wrong about that, but I persisted. And so now, I returned in 2008. So it's been, about 17 years now, operating from the Netherlands. Yeah.
Yeah, and working internationally.
Yes, exactly. So in those years, I've worked mostly abroad. Most of our clients and our projects are abroad. So my company, on one end, we provide services, strategy, concept design for organizations that really want to make a significant impact. And that always has to be a good business model behind it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It has to be realistic. It has to have its feet on the ground and its head in the clouds. I am motivated by the snowball effect of systems thinking, the ability to, almost like acupuncture, be able to pinprick relatively small things and achieve a very great result, which is, I believe, one of the only antidotes we have to the exponential damage we are doing to our living environment, society, and economic systems. So if we, pit one exponential curve against the other, we may hope to both prevent damage on the one hand, but I'm mostly motivated by actually the vast, fantastic opportunities this brings to rewire our society towards a much better place for everyone, from the bottom to the top.
This reminds me directly with Donna Meadows with the 12 intervention points.
Yes, so systems thinking has been fundamental for the shaping of my mind and my way of thinking. I consider Meadows to be a great inspiration and a shoulder of a giant on which I try to do certain things. There are others as well.
Could you name those?
I'm never very good with names, but Forster has to be mentioned, of course. And then, all the stuff that happened in the Club of Rome afterwards. And then one of my biggest inspirations was actually Joseph Tainter, who wrote a book called, it's a very nice children's book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And it sounds very boring, but it's actually a riveting read in which he has analyzed hundreds of societies of the past and extracts from it. It extracts from it a somewhat systems-oriented formula for why societies move towards a brittle state and then collapse. So whether or not the Mayans or the fifth dynasty of the Chinese or a small, a small tribe in Africa or even the Netherlands, which had a partial collapse during the tulip crisis, I believe 17th century, could be defined as a partial collapse, and how that goes and how that works, and the fact that those are almost like universal laws of nature, like gravity and thermodynamics, is incredibly fundamental to being able to understand complex systems without necessarily having to bottom up quantify every little step of the way. So that was born within me another type of systems thinking, which I capture under the word complexity thinking. So there's different schools of systems thinking these days, right? So there's the bottom up, almost mechanical or classic systems thinking, which is still from the idea that you could potentially, if you could model everything, then you could predict what the system will be doing.
Okay.
There's this fantastic example of, in the 70s, a group of scientists collecting more and more data, putting it into a computer system in order to analyze I think it was a savanna area of Arizona. And the more data they put in, the more the model diverged from reality.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it took hundreds of millions, and it was, very expensive with these early computer systems. And it led to total collapse of the scientific experiment. And the lead science researcher actually had a heart attack at the end of it because it was so utterly frustrating and disappointing. Mm-hmm. And I think a huge lesson we can learn from his contribution is that complex systems cannot be analyzed from that perspective in order to be predictive.
Yeah.
So if we want to understand what's going to happen in the future, there's no way that we will be able to build a mathematical model to give us answers.
Yeah.
But we can build models to help us test our assumptions, to learn from how dynamic systems could work.
Yeah.
But then the top-down perspective, which I find increasingly interesting, is far more about almost, psychology of human beings being cell of a larger superorganism that has a psychology, has behavioral dynamics associated with it that simply cannot be predicted, but we can learn to understand the behavioral characteristics of what could happen and the interrelationships between that.
Is from my perspective, is that what, for instance, like Meta and Google Alphabet are doing? Because they are harnessing so much social behavior data from us.
I think that's still kind of, maybe on one end, yes, but it's still kind of a technocratic perspective on trying to build even AI, which is not, we all know these language models are not really AI, but pattern recognition.
Yes.
Which you could also argue that our brains are pattern recognizers. But I believe humanity as a whole, we can explain things from the past using that form of thinking, but going forward to the future and to be able to formulate what could be cannot derive out of such a system. So we can learn, absolutely learn from big data and things like that. They are useful tools, but I don't think that they're necessarily going to be all that useful in creating the scenarios and the planning and the solutions of where we need to be going. Otherwise, I think we will be just extrapolating a pathway which we've been on, which is very obviously not the one that many of us want to be on.
Or like many of us will survive on.
Exactly.
Because that's interesting. You have also the movement Planetary Boundaries from Stockholm Resilience Center.
Yeah.
And if you follow their reasoning and their look into the future together, also maybe with the Club of Rome report,
Limits to
Growth. Then you see that we will we go at a point where there will be happening something, and what it actually will be, nobody knows.
I think we already passed that point.
And based on what assumptions?
Based on what we're seeing happening in the last 20 years.
From a climate perspective?
Climate, I would say that our economy and our maybe even macroeconomic / geopolitical dynamics are very much shaped by these underlying rules. We're seeing more conflict. We're seeing more instability. We're seeing more uncertainty. We're seeing, which is, if you would follow the original lesson from Tainter, from his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, there's this curve. It kind of looks like an S, but it's not the same as the S curve that's often described when we're talking about innovation and its adaptive curve and its growth. Okay. But it kind of is, but then it goes on and then it goes down. And the downward part is when complexity of society increases, its increasing marginal cost will actually go up for every contributing agent that you add to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex way of saying the bigger and more sophisticated we become means that our resource needs go up exponentially. And if we don't have a replacement for that, the system will crack and start to fail somewhere.
That's interesting because I have the idea that a lot of people don't make that connection.
I think it's been obvious for decades already.
Yeah, but I think for the mainstream, people don't see you just buy the things you need and don't realize that there is an exponential extraction behind that.
Yeah, there is. And it's an adding on of exponents. So we have, I remember 20 years ago when I first started my company, you'd have very basic conversations, typically around, there's someone's dinner party and you're having a conversation about sustainability. 25 years ago, it wasn't really a major topic of conversation. A lot of people told me that I should stop wasting my time, which is kind of interesting. And then 10 years later, everyone's kind of on the bandwagon, but we're talking about replacing plastic bags in the supermarket with recycled plastic bags. It's so much better. And that side of what I call object-oriented or surface-level things that if you really look at them systemically, no matter how well-intentioned they are, and no matter how much you think that at the end of the pipe you're kind of saving something, systemically speaking, they often either do basically nothing or only such marginal changes that it doesn't really have a significant impact, or they almost have a counter effect in some cases. For example, bioplastic bags, if you throw them into the normal plastic bag recycling, then it can degrade the batch that can then no longer be recycled into another thing. So we've got these kind of kickback things inside of the system that you need to be aware of. And in the first few years when I was working on these kinds of projects, I ran into some of them. So there was one huge project that I did in, it was I think 1999 when I started the first year. There was a big social housing corporation in Rotterdam, and the largest one in the Netherlands, and they wanted to replace all the normal incandescent light bulbs with power-saving light bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
The power-saving light bulbs they're made out of kind of a glass spiral.
Yeah, they were the predecessors of the LEDs.
Exactly, right. So I collaborated with them and created a kind of a campaign with a piece of software, an online gamified thing, and a strategy that we didn't have to go to everyone's houses, but there was kind of a game that allowed people to get them at the supermarket for free and put them in themselves, and which housing block is the first one to have that score and so on. And it was really great, and it was a huge success because the adoption rate was, I believe, over 70 or 80%.
That seems to be good.
And that's amazing. And in the end, I think we did more than 200,000 light bulbs within 1 year. And it cost the housing corporation basically nothing because the power that they were saving through the structures that they had was what. But 2 years later, I read in a science article that these power-saving light bulbs, they contain mercury. And if they break outside of a controlled environment, that mercury will evaporate and will end up in our environment, which will then be at some point eaten by something because it's a bioaccumulative substance. And then in the end, it will end up on our plate, mostly in the fish that we eat. And that is incredibly difficult to remove from our environment. So therefore, the conclusion was, you better not do this, replace an incandescent with a power-saving light bulb, because you're moving energy use into environmental damage.
Mm-hmm.
So you better wait 2 or 3 more years until the LED is actually commercially ready, which we already knew at that time, and then do it. And so I felt incredibly guilty.
Mm-hmm.
You have this great, fantastic project that you did, but then you look at it just shortly after and you say, it would have been better if we did nothing at all. And I didn't want to have that feeling ever again. And I'm not saying that it will never happen again, because, we can't know everything. But it was the foundation of the methodology that I started developing, Symbiosis in Development, of which I wrote the book Omnibus, which describes the whole systems thinking in connection with an innovation methodology and how to implement that practically to develop a strategy for a company or for a product or for a policy or something like that, and how to collaborate with multiple experts in the process in order to arrive at in a very efficient kind of co-creation way. And that kind of then includes that responsibility to check whatever you're doing against a 360-degree perception of how we can subdivide our world, energy, materials, but also ecosystems and their impact on species, biodiversity, cultural aspects, law, regulation, culture, art, economic aspects, job creation, transport, finance, down to health and happiness of all the individuals that are involved.
Human beings, or also the
all living things, because it's kind of like a branching thing. And then from that, it's kind of the bottom up thing, the way that Donatello Meadows almost would construct the idea of a complex system, but then it attaches that to more of a what I would call top down complexity perception of that the system as a whole needs to be resilient, autonomous, and harmonious in order to be able to continue to function and thrive on this planet. So if we're not resilient, then something can continue to exist, but something unexpected happens and it will break, which is kind of what Tainter wrote about. That's a very important component. Then there's autonomy, which is, okay, we need to have enough of our core resources to be able to survive, which ties very much into the circular economy and being self-sufficient and renewable energy and things like that. And then there's harmony, which sounds fluffy, but without harmony, we will basically create war and, riots and social discontent to a degree that the system will collapse from the inside out. So harmony is very much about social justice, about the distribution of power and resources.
Yeah, but also connects to autonomy, because if everybody can be autonomous, there is much more harmony.
Yes, so these three things, they actually they influence each other greatly, because increased autonomy in many cases also decreases resilience. And that,
That's interesting.
Yeah. So for example, if you have a small village and you're entirely autonomous and you're keeping it that way, that may also mean you may not invest in relationships with others and set up kind of mutual beneficial trade and things like that, that if something happens to a critical resource of yours, then it's much more difficult to get that support from others. And besides a very practical point, at this point in human history, it's completely impossible for any country even to be actually fully autonomous. You can be autonomous in your primary needs, water, power, food, to some degree. But, I'm not going to be able to grow coconuts efficiently in the Netherlands or avocados. So do we want to stop eating them for the sake of autonomy?
Don't say it too loud. The greenhouse guys can do a lot nowadays.
They can, of course, but, you have to weigh, you have to weigh these things. And just like, let's say, for example, we've been developing this fully sustainable, self-sufficient, autonomous, resilient, climate adaptive city model for some years now. Orchid City, it's called. And investing huge amount in collecting the data.
That's an interesting case, Orchid City. I thought when I read it on the social media from you, I thought it was somewhere in Asia, but actually it was I just by the name, I thought it was located there, but it actually is a sort of a concept.
Yeah, it's a blueprint development framework. You kind of want to be exact about it. So it allows us to go anywhere in the world and within a very short amount of time collect some basic input data.
Yeah,
and then we get the program and the base configuration for what it takes to build a fully self-sustainable living environment there.
Wait, is that for new cities, existing cities,
Both.
refurbished?
Both. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And each one in every location will be very different. It's completely adaptive to its environment. And that's why it's called Orchid City, by the way. But I can explain that in a second. And it can be as small as a campus and can be a huge city. And of course, the parameters will change, the density, the configuration, the architecture. But it will give, for example, governments or big developers a very clear strategic guideline on the dot on the horizon. Doesn't mean it has to be all the way up to 100% all the time, but it at least shows you what it would take to do that. And then to understand, what is the business model that you could actually capture. And there's the interesting part. Because for everyone who lives there, it is an actual significant value for them to know and to be actively part of their basic living needs, including food. So if you can be part of a community and you know that at least for a certain basic...
Could you define basic?
Well, basic is not simply providing the caloric value that science says that you will need to eat. So the Orchid City model has more than, I believe, 12 different agricultural systems in the model that we can throttle against, from advanced greenhouses to simple, just
urban gardening
to permaculture projects, to more intense agricultural methods, various aquacultures, both open and controlled and things like that. And that allows us to mix and match a diet.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, so if you then reduce, especially big animal intake by 20 or 30%, you can be self-sustaining within a reasonable area. And that reasonable area, and here's where the fun part starts, because from a systems thinking perspective, that's that land on which those activities take place isn't just space where you would be producing food. It also contributes to, for example, the water purification system that you're running through it. You are actually using the farm as a catalyzer between certain resources and others. So, for example, certain waste streams that you can then process, and then you can create alternative protein that we may not want to eat,
like insects,
but the cattle wants to eat. And so you create these systems where, for example, chickens are fantastic recyclers of bread that we can no longer really eat, but the chickens can. So you use animals in a strategic way, so we don't all have to go 100% vegetarian per se.
So to rephrase that, you're not seeing animals as a protein source, but to a lesser degree of a protein source, more as a transformer.
Yeah, just as we ourselves are in that sense, and just as industry is, for example. So an Orchid City has industry. So we produce durable consumer goods, clothing, household items, depending on the location and the size, it may have different things. But one great system is System of Biome, which is a company in the UK, which is a partner of Orchid City. They create reactors in which they use fungi to process organic waste, and that is then processed into material that is ideal for insulating your house, or even facade paneling. So we're using these circular systems within kind of a resilient climate adaptive system. Yeah. So anyway, I get carried away because I love it so much.
No, but it's the point. Yeah. The point I wanted to bring in is that I just read a book. It's something about a knot, and it's written by a Indian woman from the US or Canada. I don't remember exactly. And she described the knowledge of indigenous people. And I still don't like the word indigenous, but it's the way we framed it. And their view of nature is that it is so much more integrated within their own being. And the way you're now describing Orchid City, it just reminds me of that book.
Right.
Bringing back the cycles and using them because they always have a use for it. So the city can build itself out of the waste streams, which is so contradictory to the way we are being raised and trained. So the more waste you have, let's say food waste you have, the more houses you can build. Just use that as a framing.
Right.
Or the more waste you have, the more food you have. I mean, I think there was also a story of El Dorado in the Amazon, and the Spanish always thought that was gold, but actually it was manure. And the compost these Amazonian people of the community could create. And the more compost they have, the more farming they could produce, the more people they could sustain in the middle of a jungle.
Right.
And the way you're describing Orchid City is like we're going back to the past with a modern take.
Yeah, if you will, it's kind of like capturing the full value of the living environment that we're actually in. Who doesn't want to live in a rich, biodiverse, green, lush landscape? I mean, first and foremost, it creates real estate value. So the thing is, because funny enough, because I started 25 years ago in the Netherlands, and you're Dutch like me, that nothing's ever going to fly in the Netherlands if it doesn't make money.
True. Yeah.
And you can't really talk about very lofty, dreamy ideas here. Everything gets flattened down to basics. So you may almost hear me automatically flip to that, like so resource flows and things like that. But the symbiotic patterns that something like Orchid City can capture for our psychological and social well-being, connectivity between elderly and younger generations, our educational system, the ideas of ownership, sharing, and of what is nature and how are we part of that, and how do we create our identity out of such a way of living. They're very much foundational to the whole concept. But then what's very important to me is that Orchid City it's realistic.
Yeah.
It could be built today. We don't need any new technology. Everything that is in the model already exists and has been proven elsewhere. It's just how you connect them.
Yeah, and how you integrate it.
Yeah, so it can be built. It's profitable. It can adapt to all these various conditions, which is, by the way, what orchids do. Being the last innovation of nature, of the plant world almost.
Really?
Yeah, so my head of science came up with the name, and he said, yeah, we should call it Orchid City. I'm like, okay, it's nice, I like orchids, but why? He said, well, orchids are one of the latest evolutionary innovations of the plant world.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they've only been around for a very short amount of time, relatively, they've conquered the world. Every continent, every area, every biome has orchids. And the orchids have thrived because they are so utterly symbiotic in how they evolved, having symbiotic relationships with insects, with plant life and soil. You even have floating orchids that just hang in the air and absorb moisture from the air in that way. And they completely have changed their whole way of they look, because many orchids look like the genitals of the insects that they want to attract and things like that. So within a short time, they conquered the world in a very symbiotic way and made the world a more beautiful place, because they are very peaceful in that sense. They are cooperative in nature. And the second reason, he said, well, they have 5 leaves and they stand for the 5 components of our Orchid City, which is living, working, production, so we get back to the Dutch kind of, love for little diagrams. But yeah, so I like very much that idea that because orchid cities completely change their blueprint on where they are in the world, but they operate on the same principles.
That makes me curious. I'm a really fan of the Bullet Center in Seattle. I don't know if you know that building. The founder wanted to go beyond BREEAM, and he wanted to set a new standard. So the whole roof is solar panel, water is recuperated inside with plants, and extra oxygen is then pumped back into the offices. They have the yoga place downstairs. So so sort of the idea was to get as much of the grid as possible with everything, and have a building that pays itself off. And I assume that the solar energy would be sold on the grid to have a business model. And I added on that. That means that you as a renter would not necessarily have to pay rent because the building itself is a producing system, and therefore contributes to the bigger picture. And now I feel it's more relevant as you see that globally rents are going up. The cost of housing is exploding. So either you earn more, or if not, you're gonna be deprived of many other aspects, and moving towards a clash somewhere, as you mentioned before. So my question is, did you have that also incorporated in Orchid City, that the neo-capitalism way of financing it and operating it is taken out, and it's more like the economics of before the 1920s?
Yeah,
or maybe before the 17th century, because the Dutch tulip explosion is said to be contributed to the neo-capitalism way of thinking.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, surely, and I mean, I love the example of that building. By the way, the building we're sitting in here does something similar, actually. If I have the ability to work together with a developer that would be open for that, absolutely. I don't want to inhibit the development of Orchid Cities by saying that we need to achieve 100% on every single one of those items. But ideally speaking, an Orchid City would be owned in its entirety by the community that lives there.
That's interesting.
And you can work with a model that transitions from the current classic model of real estate development, of development/bank ownership, which then reaps the profits, and then transition through sales into an occupant-owned system. And if you make sure that those rules are set well at the start, then I think that would be a very feasible process. But if you don't, if you have an existing system and you're trying to transform that into a more holistic, symbiotic idea of ownership and sharing resources and so on, then it's nearly impossible.
Yeah, because the invested interests are too deep to make it happen.
And I think, so something like Orchid City provides a lot of value to all the parties that are in the development chain of it. So for the developer themselves, basically you'd say it's very innovative. And so, yeah, but it's also rather low risk because you're decoupling to a large degree from a lot of market fluctuations that are going increasingly haywire, like energy price and resource and things like that.
Interest rate.
Yeah, but also climate adaptive town is going to have so much advantages over many other places that are dealing with increased problems with, let's just say, insurance. Especially, let's say, in the United States, there are whole regions that you can't insure your home anymore. I mean, Louisiana is suffering from this greatly, and there will be increasing areas.
And Louisiana is because don't think most people know that.
Yeah, because of after Hurricane Katrina, they are at climate risk, so they are at the risk of flooding from natural disasters to a degree where you can't insure your home anymore. And if you can't insure your home, you can't get a mortgage, and if you can't get a mortgage, you can't get a house. So the houses in those areas are, they greatly devalued, if not, abandoned. And there's whole regions of, let's say, Florida, which are at the cusp of being in that position. So climate risk is turning into very real, concrete, everyday worries for a lot of people in the world. And that's also part of that more longer term way of thinking that is incorporated in our framework, Symbiosis in development, but also in something like Orchid City, that you're building something that will be there in 100, 150, 200 years, 500 years. And that sounds crazy, but it really isn't, because how many cities that we really live in now have already been around for more than that? And, many of them will continue to be around, but at what cost, and how will they need to transform? And how can they, for example, big city like, I don't know, New York or even Amsterdam, how do those cities relate to the supply chains of their daily necessities that need to be shorter, more local, more resilient towards market disruptions, which we already see happening around. I mean, with the whole tariff discussion and so on.
Yeah, I had a conversation with somebody in the greenhouse sector, and specifically on the seed business, which is mostly situated in the Netherlands.
Right.
If something happens and the whole supply chain is disrupted, for what reason, and they cannot ship seeds for, let's say, a couple of months, this would be a total collapse for the agricultural sector. And that's scared the hell out of me.
Part of a long list of things that will collapse the agriculture. And so we as humans are so fantastic at forgetting even recent events. I mean, Corona shook up the world, and we all saw a new light of a new dawn in for the positive things that came out of it. But so much has been forgotten so rapidly.
Yeah,
but
true.
also the Ever Given, right? Is that ship that kind of went sideways in the Suez Canal, which disrupted global supply chains for weeks. And why? And that's coming back to Tainter. That's exactly part of Tainter's kind of curve. We're saying it's going well until it keeps growing and it keeps being more and more complex. Like, let's say, international shipping.
Yeah.
Until the moment that it doesn't. And then, you get a trigger and you get an avalanche and a kind of, snowball effect, negative one. And then the whole global supply chain is disrupted because one guy or one ship, let's just one ship, you decide to go eat.
Yeah.
And, it's
too efficient.
It's too complex. There's too many cause and effect chains.
Yeah.
The chains are so long,
and
so many of them intersect each other, that a disruption in a completely different area, let's say in this case shipping, will disrupt literally the availability of food in Canada. It just, you get this
very rapid trickle down.
Yeah.
But that makes me curious. I'm just thinking of ants, because they have a very complex society, and they are with a lot, and yet they seem to function because they always find a way very rapidly to adapt to a new challenge. So I'm just sort of, it's interesting that we've created supply chains that are extremely efficient, extremely complex, but totally not resilient.
Exactly. Resilience is not a KPI within most organizations' evaluation of their strategy. And that's why in my book, resilience is the number one thing that I advocate for. That should be a major KPI. Because in a world that is unpredictable and increasingly complex, resilience will be the determining factor whether or not you survive.
How fast can you cope with the change?
Yes.
But however, if there are too many changes in a short time, you will not cope with that. So, but it's interesting because when I always have a conversation about my clients or talking with people about the economies that we've been used, at least in the Western world, so let's say Europe, after the Second World War, we only have known growth. We only were going up, and now suddenly we're at the top. And the good thing about going up is that you step in and you do business as usual, pick the standard manual, and you will make money. And now we're at the point that the manual is not working, because now that knowledge is not sufficient to be able to run a company, because so many things are changing and you're not on the upside curve. Maybe it goes down, but it's like a Tour de France. You up down hills and you never know which next mountain suddenly emerges. But that also does something with our minds, because if you've been used to that and been educated that by your parents for, let's say, the last 50 years, and suddenly it's not working anymore, that's mentally frustrating.
It is. And there's actually a very important thing that you touch on there about that mental frustration. There's also when we, as you were saying, for a very long time, for generations, we've been in a growth mindset. And the thing is, we were able to grow. So, putting your chips on the table towards growth would yield result. Now we're at a moment where we're hitting the limits to growth, where many times growth is either not possible or actually detrimental. Then the big question is, then what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
And so at a point like this, when we can no longer rely on what was familiar, a psychological response is fear.
Yeah.
And fear causes us to retreat and not want to experiment, not want to invest in diverse directions.
And open up, basically.
And open up, which is exactly what you should be doing. It's just kind of like, I use this analogy a lot. When you're really hungry, because it was difficult to find food in your cabin, around your cabin in the woods, does it help to retreat and sit in your cabin because you're afraid you're going to be hungry? Or are you going to get rewarded by going over that hill that you've never been to before, or going that extra mile? Of course, going that extra mile and seeking further away and doing things you haven't done before
But that's sort of as long as the pain is hard enough, then that's the reason to change.
Yes, and so I believe that here in the Netherlands, the pain isn't hard enough yet because we're all nice and comfortable. But in countries like, for example, Vietnam, where I'm working about half of the time now, people have still in recent memory a war.
The hardship, yeah.
A real hardship. So they know what that's like, and they are actively working away from that. And for them, it makes perfect sense. You don't need to come up with a very complicated feasibility analysis to show them that investing in something that will allow them to be climate adaptive towards flash floods of the Mekong River is a good idea. It is. So, and we've been sitting here behind the Delta Works being pretty safe for a long time, but we are also have been unraveling the structures and the organizations that did have that mindset that got us there.
So we broke them all down. Yeah.
We broke them down. I like saying, in the Netherlands we had the Ministry of VROM, which is the Ministry of Housing. We don't have that anymore for a decade or more, 15 years or something. I'm probably wrong with that number, but for quite some time. And now we're in a housing crisis. We've got, 900,000 houses too little. Who could have seen that coming? Well, obviously, a Ministry of Housing would have helped. Not saying that it would have cured us from that situation, but
the point you're making is that if you understand what the future will bring and you have a vision on how to overcome that and how to get the resources and the structure to get it done, then it's much easier and a much bigger flow than when it's put in your face, we have a problem, then it takes so much time.
Absolutely.
To find the right route with all the invested interests which are there. And if governments don't have a vision of the future, of how the future should look like, then there is no guidance.
And there is no vision.
Yeah.
There's no vision here. Many countries don't have a vision at all. The visions are are created and manifested and spread by individuals mostly, not even large organizations. Like, for example, myself, we were just talking about before this, is that, I realized that I have always been in love with the beauty of cooperation and collaboration with a group of like-minded people to achieve a lot. But almost every successful vision in the world, whether or not it's technology-wise or transformative-wise, is attached to an individual with a particular name and a particular status that have been able to manifest themselves as a global brand. And that works. But a sizable organization trying to permeate those visions and ideas is much less common. And in order to get financing for something like this, which I've been trying to do for 25 years, like, we still find it incredibly hard to find sources of money for these sorts of things.
Like Orchid City or
like Orchid City, but also the precursors to that, like halfway there, or pieces of software that you want to develop that would enable communities to build these kinds of systems themselves. And yes, there's good business models behind it. Yes, it will make money. However, they are so different that they don't have access to capital.
But and that is, I mean, yeah. Then it's also like, is it proprietary software, or do you want to be open source? And if it's open source, hours have to get paid because people have a mortgage to pay, so that has to get financed in some way.
Yeah, but they're profitable projects. I mean, the business models, they take that into account.
Yeah, so once one project runs, you can finance your development, but then the development goes before the development.
Always.
Yeah,
that's what investment is.
What investment is about.
Yeah. But so, yeah, the interesting thing is that a lot of these things kind of come together, and they create a certain necessary complexity. Orchid City isn't complex because we want it to be, but because the world is complex. And in order to face the reality of the world and to create something that has a meaningful relationship with that, in order for us to adapt and flourish and thrive in that, it needs to embrace that complexity and give an answer to all of these different aspects of it. And that's where you end up with. So here's an interesting question for you. I've explained to you a little bit how Orchid City works and kind of what it is. But for many years, we did the math. Like, okay, so if these are the ideas and these are the technologies, what if we put it all together? What, regarding climate change, just carbon, we can talk about a lot of different KPIs like water, energy, happiness years or whatever, but just let's say just carbon.
And then you mean CO2 levels.
CO2. So as compared to a person that's not living, and just a normal average person, let's say in the Netherlands, that's just living their life, and a person in Orchid City, how much of a reduction of a carbon footprint do you think that individual will have from going from their normal life into
if Orchid City is local food production, local waste extraction, sustainable energy, not necessarily solar panels or wind, but there are so many other potential different energy sources you can use, then it would go drastically down, and I would not imagine if that would be 60-70%.
Right. That's what I thought. That's what we thought. So that gave us hope in order to do the math.
Yeah. And
at the time, I remember my head of science at the time, Jacob Verhaert, was literally a rocket scientist. It was fantastic. And he called me in and he said, "Tom, we are done." And I know that when he says that we are done, that it had been triple or quadruple calculated. And so he said, "Okay, so let me come to the office." So it was right there behind you that I sat down and I looked at the spreadsheet at that one cell that we had been building towards. And the cell said the reduction per capita expressed in percentage of a one person was 140%.
I can, but
So
yeah,
I looked at that and I looked at him and I was like, does this mean what I think it means? And he says, yes, it does. So that means that for everyone who lives in an orchid city, you're not just going to zero being climate neutral, but you're actually compensating 40% for someone who doesn't even live there. So as a project, Orchid City as a whole, the bottom line is that you're being truly regenerative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also regenerative in, biodiversity and landscape regeneration, that sort of aspects, due to its agroforestry and permaculture aspects and
That makes me curious, because if you introduce biodiversity into a city, you get foxes, I don't know, maybe wolves, reindeer, maybe inside cities.
Wow.
Yeah. Because biodiversity is such a blown up concept nowadays. It's framed anything you want it to be. However, for me, biodiversity is bringing nature back to its original path. That means bringing forests back, stop using grassland for cattle, and putting trees on it, because that is what soil wants to be. Soil wants to create trees, and not just to be green. Because I don't know. I also go to the to the zoo in Rotterdam, and there I learned that we had bisons in Europe. I mean, I know that we had them in America, because we know the pictures of the bisons being killed by the colonists, but I never knew we had them in Europe.
Mm.
And they were the pollinators of grassland. So for me, biodiversity it's much more than just we have to get the bees inside cities again. For me, it's like, can you actually live in a city which is designed like a forest,
right?
And then we don't have to be afraid of wolves, whatever, because if you don't know how to live with these creatures, then they will attack you. But if you know how to live with them, then there was a story about these wolves, for instance, and I think it was in France. They were used to have a loss of 20% of the sheep group. The 20% was for the wolves.
Yeah.
And now they want 100% for themselves.
Yeah.
And then nature will bite back, because it wants to coexist with humans.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion. And biodiversity is such a vast, rich, and fascinating aspect of our planetary development trajectory. Don't even want to use the word sustainability anymore these days, because it just gets put into a certain corner.
Yeah.
It's just literally about survival of mankind on this planet. Biodiversity is absolutely foundational. And what's interesting, what I have found interesting, is because I'm not a biologist. I am an industrial design engineer, an architect, but I've surrounded myself with ecologists and biologists for a long time to learn from them, and I picked up a few things. And one of these things that fascinated me was when you measure biodiversity, you basically don't even look at that macrofauna, which is we call foxes or a mammoth or even bees are to some degree, they're insects, but they're still macrofauna-ish. When you want to know and measure the biodiversity of a place, and maybe you know this, but I think maybe others don't, and it's really fascinating. You basically just take a scoop of soil of the area and you count the microorganisms that are in there. And that is a very accurate predictor of the biodiversity. So you don't need to count the seagulls and the snails, the martyrs and the green striped red-eyed frog. You need to look at the composition of the microorganisms in the soil, and they are determinant. And they are not just determinants for what actually then the microfauna will be. So you measure one thing and you get the result for another, basically. But they are absolutely straightforwardly correlated with the productivity of your agriculture. So soil and healthy soil, it sounds so down to earth, but it's such fundamental. It's very complex.
The Finnish have done so much research on this. They have. I think the last thing I've just read is that the asthma of the Russians living next to Finland was so low that they started researching about that, and they discovered that kids who have asthma and exposed to soil, so basically playing in playgrounds with black soil, humus-like soil, and they digest that, their asthma goes down by 70-80%.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Isn't it?
And then if you go to cities, which for me are like urban deserts, especially on summer days and there is a wind, you just get blown away. It's just walking through a desert, and there's nothing green. All the dust is not sticking to anything.
Right.
And for me, a city should have so much more green, trees that actually thrive, and basically, how do you call that? That no dust is able to leave the ground and stays there. I mean, I've even read a research that the oxygen levels in big cities is dropping. Everybody's focusing on CO2, but we should focus on oxygen. Big cities have an oxygen shortage, and they have shown research that you have the how do you call it, platteland?
The rural area.
The rural area has a certain level, and then you go to the city and you see suddenly a drop.
Yeah. So air quality. I mean, the thing is that's one of those other things that we don't really all talk about all that often, even though we talk about water and food all the time. But air is the thing that's actually keeping us going, right? Oxygen is the engine of our biological world. So very true. And air quality is a particular thing. And then we get kind of like to a point where we were talking about earlier before we started the recording is, I showed you the project that we did in San Francisco, which is like the world's largest ecosystem rooftop.
Mm-hmm.
And the people ask me something, why are you calling it an ecosystem rooftop instead of why it's just not a rooftop garden? And that is, because there is a fundamental difference. So this project isn't like there's a whole bunch of potted plants and there's some grass on it. It has a proper 2-meter humus layer in which...
That's huge.
That's huge. I mean, that's the reason also why it can really act as a water sponge and help to evaporate that water on hot days to cool down the area. But more importantly, it has a rich microorganism substrate that keeps all of those plants and trees that are on there alive. So it actually costs much less in maintenance, which is also nice. But what science is showing is that plants don't actually clean the air unless they are in soil with microorganisms that break down, because the plants, they capture the particulates in the air through static electricity, which is what we were also talking about, because they're charged, and then they transfer them to their root system where the exchange of, because the economy of the biological world takes place with all the fungi and the microorganisms over there. That's where it gets processed. So if you have these plants that are in an office environment that are on those beads, those beads, that means those plants are actually just they're kind of like, they're not fake plants, but almost, because they don't process, don't increase air quality, because they don't process the contaminants in the air. And this is research by NASA, actually. And because of that, we've been doing experiments here in the office with different soil types, because, how much maintenance do they need and whatnot. But so this is how we learn about the biological world, and these are fairly basic things, where actually if you would just embrace the complexity of the value and the beauty of true nature and not some potted plant in a box, right, in living systems, and integrate that, it will give you so much more than you could even ever write down as plus sides on an equation. It's a fundamental part of a valuable and resilient and future-proof life.
Yeah, and others would use the word abundance. But, but that's also negative.
And the beauty of it is it's so cheap compared to stuffing your life full of machines. So something that is, I believe, just so fascinating to see is that something like NEOM. Do you know NEOM?
No, what's that?
NEOM is the proposed 100-mile long city in the desert in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I've read about that. It's
Right.
one big line.
It's basically, it's taller than the Empire State Building, and there's two of them next to each other, and then extruded for 100 miles. It's just...
Could you explain for us the idea about it and what the design is? Because most people have no idea.
Yeah, so it's in the north of Saudi Arabia, where the climate is a little bit more agreeable, and the idea is to go from the coast through to the mountainous range. 100 miles is roughly between Amsterdam and Brussels or something. That's kind of the distance of 100 miles. And then that would be a linear city, as they call it, in which, there would be 2 train lines going back and forth all the time. And people would live there in fully serviced, air-conditioned places where hydroponics would be creating all their food, and solar panels on the top would be creating all the energy.
And with what purpose?
To create a high-tech, sustainable city.
And what do people do for a living?
Yeah, they do whatever they are supposed to do.
No, if it's governmental jobs and this.
No. I think it's for people that have a little bit more money than that. Okay. I think that's the idea, that it's for well-to-do. And then the project has been to some degree scaled back. Mm-hmm. But I was also very early kind of... I wasn't involved, but I studied, and then I was asked to become design director of the Masdar city development, which is a sustainable city in the Emirates. And I looked at the plan, and I looked at what their ambition was, and my conclusion was, that's not a sustainable city. This is a technocratic or techno-optimist idea of what a sustainable city is. For me, that does not do justice to what the word sustainable means. It's just stuffing your life full of machines and almost living in a spaceship that landed on Earth.
That was the analogy.
Yeah. And it's this techno-optimism that with the right technology, we are going to be saved. And there's still, because it's such an attractive thing, because technology is in our control. Technology is the ideal slave. We build it and we can disassemble it, and it will do what we want, and we can maintain it and it will operate, and we can perfectly predict and create the ideal conditions. But that is a complete fabrication of our imagination, of course, because in a world that is constantly changing, weather systems that are changing.
But material will corrode, and it needs,
exactly.
And it will not be there for thousands of years.
It will not. So it's not a resilient way of thinking at all. It's a very classic technocratical pre-World War II kind of way of constructing reality.
It reminds me of the science fiction books of those times.
Yes. And we derive a lot from those science fiction books. We've got people seriously saying that we should build a city on Mars and are investing billions of dollars into it. This is of the same kind of type. The thing is, if you would invest a fraction of that money into building something like an Orchid City, which doesn't need anywhere near that money,
or just stop polluting and getting
polluting,
stop using PFAS and that kind of chemicals, and you will get a. I think if you're using that analogy, 70% of our farmland has already been degraded. Yeah, and everybody's then complaining. We need to feed the world. Yeah, but you need to feed the world on only 30%. So let's stop having that vision, and let's go back and regenerate the 70%, because then we have food for everybody. Maybe even more people that we can carry if we bring down the cattle globally, and we go from a meat to a more plant-based diet. Then the whole food issue is solved.
True. That being said, I do understand the attractive appeal of doing a significant kind of epic project in one particular place that you can stick your name on.
But is it also that the rich people are using the word fear and what you said, and you go back to yourself, you extract yourself, that they want to have their own communities?
No, well, I think in a sense there's some practicality to, for example, you've got the Venus project, which has never been built, but it's been around from the 60s.
Yeah.
From his name escapes me. This wonderful French engineer.
That was in the US or in India? Which one?
They've been planned in various places, but it's never been built. But it's still active as an organization, and we've had a little bit to do with them in the past. But that's also kind of a technocratic idea, but from a much better, more holistic perspective. But you've got these kind of things here and there. So I do understand that, let's say you're a group of investors and you want to pour in a few $100 million into something. You wanna have a sense of control of that, and pouring that into the world agriculture system is just going to see that money disappear, and then you get some statistics back. But you just want to do this. You want to. Of course, that's great, but you just want to do this one project, and you want to put your name on it. You want to walk around and be proud of it. I get that, but they invariably seem to be these technocratic, techno-optimism kind of projects. The ones that are far more holistic and ingrained within the true fundamental meaning of building a sustainable, resilient, climate adaptive, etc. regenerative project, they are rare. Few and far between. And I think that that's something that hopefully we will see within the next decades, is a fundamental shift away from technology being the really cool thing that is investable to biology being the thing that is really cool and investable.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is that thing going on. So I visit quite a lot of investor forums, and I speak to many different funders and investors to get something like Orchid City off the ground, or the software, or even the sustainability center here and in Vietnam. And many of them are far more enamored about a piece of technology. There's whole funds. There's tons and tons of funds.
But it's because it's penetable,
predictable. But it's also a bit of a fake dependency, because it also becomes obsolete very quickly, and it becomes you get competition in it, or a bug. So it isn't secure. It's not less risky. It just requires quite a different approach. Whereas the far more ecological, biological approach of something like Orchid City doesn't necessarily immediately reach mass appeal. And I think that we're going to see a shift there, just as we've seen a shift from when I started with sustainability and everyone calling me nuts, to now being an almost given for many policies and organizations and people, that, okay, well, that's a foundational aspect of what we need to be looking at. What then sustainability means, however, is not yet fully understood. So
yeah, I've wrote down here, because for me, you have design principles, and you're an architect and an industry designer, and I think based on the work you're doing, you're very grounded in that. Because if you look at nature, you can derive certain principles you should apply to your everyday innovation, or to your business model, or to your technology, or your manufacturing system. And we've made that complicated, calling it sustainability, the ability to sustain. But that's also for a business model. A business model needs to sustain, otherwise it's obsolete. We created the word circularity, or circular economy. Well intended, but very little understood. And now we've decided, okay, let's create a new term, regenerative.
Right.
Totally. Nobody really understands what it is. It has to do with regeneration, something. But it also, for me, I've tended to break down words. It also has the word generation in there. Mm. And that has multiple things. And then we need to regenerate something which is already there. So let's start generating, because that's something we've lost.
Right.
And now we're putting the word regenerating, because we've lost something and we need to bring it back. But what are we going to bring back? And I know from your work and what I've read, and also I assume it's said in your book, Symbiose in Development, that you have an opinion on that. Okay, what is
Yeah.
What is the wide? Should we use the word sustainability, or should we bring it back to ethics and what do you want for your society, for your surrounding? I mean, architects are very good at analyzing local environments and bringing it down to certain levels from micro to macro. How would you frame it to stay away from these big words that in the first couple of years have a meaning and then completely lost by the marketing effort?
Yeah, so that's kind of what most of this big fat book is about, is that the word sustainability gets broken down into subcomponents, and those subcomponents are then defined, and then, the cause and effect between them is studied to see where each one is applicable, and in order to create a language, literally, between practitioners to agree at least on what are you trying to achieve and how are you trying to get there through which means. So to me, I've been a staunch defender of a fundamental meaning of the word sustainability.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have a long time ago decided to give up that word and start using another term like, not too long ago, I saw an architecture firm publish a book in which the first sentence said, it used to be called sustainability and now it's called the circular economy. And to me, and that whole book was about, circular economy. And that immediately told me that the authors had no idea what either of those two terms actually mean.
I agree.
And so, architects have a bit of a hand of basically automatically assuming that they understand something because they live in a world of complexity. Construction projects can be very complex. But this very much showed me, it was like, so it's also a firm that's proud of themselves being a pioneer in circular development, and look at every project, go like, none of them actually are, and that's it's a bit painful, but this happens a lot. And that's the same thing as saying, I'm a doctor and I can heal your lungs even though you don't know anything about it, and that's dangerous. So I do think you need to look at the credentials of who is saying what and which references that they are pointing to and definitions that they are using. And, in a normal conversation in a bar, that may not be that relevant. And I think it's very interesting to explore all the different dimensions of such a word, because I'm also very much a lover of trying to dissect words and gripping onto clearly identifiable meanings to it. For me, the definition in the Symbiosis in Development book of sustainability, which has been operational for about 20 years now, is very specific and very concrete, and you can test against it. My personal kind of almost like value-based definition is that sustainability is about humanity being able to continue to live on this planet and thrive. And preferably most of humanity, right? So that's kind of the very long, sketchy dot on the horizon. But in order for a sustainable society to do that, as we were mentioning before, sustainability is extracted into three components that each system, societal system, city, country, or whatever needs to have, and that's resilience, autonomy, and harmony. Those are then broken down into individual components.
Yeah, but that's very similar to how biology operates.
Yes, it is. I mean, we are biology.
Yeah, that's. But most people tend to forget that we are part of the animal kingdom, and the animal kingdom is part of biology. We tend to forget that.
Right.
That part.
And what the very, very beautiful thing about this is, and I keep trying to carry that message whenever I can, is that in the more pedestrian, kind of common way of understanding sustainability, it very much is about reducing your footprint, reducing waste, reducing energy use, reducing harm.
Yeah.
Yeah, minimize impact, reduce harm.
Well, you should start with the last one. Eliminate harm, then.
For me, if you think about this in this more holistic, systemic sense, sustainability is about how can we thrive on this planet? How can we create more of the fantastic things that we want and love.
How can we do more with less?
Well, using systems and patterns that help to fix all the other stuff.
It's interesting because I spoke to one of the other guests, and he made a reference like, actually AI is good because it teaches humans the values of history. Because we're going back to the old systems, the old technology. Because if we want to create something which is related to sustainability or product design, we're going back to simplicity. And AI is helping us to reconnect, re-understand that. And I found that interesting that somebody who was working very active in the innovation business says, maybe AI is good. That we start to design things that actually can thrive on this planet without having all the negative environmental impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that AI is a very interesting thing that has a great, like every great tool in the world, like fire. You know, it has great things to bring, great dangers and great consequences. And, you know, once we get a bit of a handle on its energy use and resource consumption, which I'm sure we will, I'm not too worried about that, then, you know, I would rather trust asking a question to AI than just simply putting it into Google and seeing what people on Reddit are telling me about it.
Or you need to find the right person to ask the question to.
Right, but perhaps that's you know, AI also. I mean, in a sense, there's a very good reason why it's mostly the search engine companies that are, you know, all in on AI, because it really replaces the search engine. We have questions. We as humanity, I mean, we're all children and we keep asking questions, even though a lot of them cannot be answered. You know, why is this? Why is that? Why is that? Well, AI can, if, you know, properly tuned and so on, and it's getting better, you know, all the time.
And keeps access open to all the resources and not limited us to the certain areas, because that's also what you see with AI, that they exclude you from certain libraries.
True, but honestly, you know, I don't know, I can't name all my high school and university teachers, but they did the same thing. You know, you get a teacher with a particular set of opinions, and then they'll be biased, and I don't think we need to be afraid of bias. I just feel that we need to be very aware and cognizant of bias. Just like a good newspaper is never neutral. You can't.
It's also biased.
Yeah. So it's always biased, and therefore, you know, you want to have a bit of a spread. So read 3 newspapers, and preferably from 3 different sides of the world. So, you know, that's what I try to do. Not always. I'm not a saint in that regard, but I am aware of it. So, you know, you can use it as social media if you're very aware of it. And that's why it's dangerous to have kids that do not have that awareness be exposed without guidance. But I think just like any powerful tool, you can work with kids to allow them access, but they need guidance. You're not going to let them walk around with a chainsaw without guidance. But I've seen some 12-year-olds make chainsaw art. You can do that. So I have a very nuanced perspective on this. Also on AI, in general, I would say I have learned over the course of my decades of working in sustainability that being judgmental and being a rather fundamentalist against certain technologies or certain mechanisms or something has very little use, because many things that exist in the world have a function that can positively contribute somewhere in a particular context. They are useful. The internal combustion engine isn't an evil thing.
Yeah, totally not.
It can, I mean, you know, up until the day that it's possible to have perfect, you know, ambulances and firefighting equipment that can run on electricity, it's the best solution to have for that thing, or for some.
For me, the only thing with combustion engine is that it has an exhaust pipe, which we forgot to close the loop with.
Right.
I mean, if you put it into your gasoline tank and then you go to the tank station and you extract everything what's in there and they make new hydrocarbons from it, then the cycle is closed.
Yeah, I think that if that was possible, they would have already kind of done that. But either way, it's not a black and white.
No,
and so that's also what you get. Then you get these very basic conversations about sustainability. It's like, oh, but do you then drive an electric car, or do you then do this, or do you that? It's all this kind of surface level stuff again. And the thing is that if we as humanity do not move in patterns towards that dot on the horizon, that vision that most countries are actually lacking, then we're going to be scattered and we're not going to make the cutoff lines.
But is the Catholic influence also in there, that you buy electric because then you have the feeling that you just bought your environmental consciousness?
Absolutely. I mean, the people, we are emotional creatures. We do that kind of stuff all the time.
Yeah, okay, but then I understand that.
We even feel better when we read a book about sustainability. We feel that we are a better person, you know. And the thing is that each of us as individuals have very little control. Like the biggest control that we have is basically twofold. One, our voting. Who are we voting for? So what are we collectively doing as a country or a region? And number two is, what do you do with your work? Like, how are you spending your productive hours as a contributor to society? And how do those hours add up to either adding to the detriment or towards a positive development?
Is there also ethics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you get so I had a girlfriend for a while that worked for Shell. I believe you also did, or at least you have.
My dad worked for Shell, and that was very beneficial in the 70s.
Right, exactly. So, but you can have a very long discussion about that. You know, are you helping the system to change from within? It is necessary. We need oil. We need
for the foreseeable future.
For the foreseeable future.
And some oil companies have the best efficient oil refineries in the world.
Yeah. But, you know, some of them also have practices that could definitely be, you know, determined as being really rather criminal or illegal or unethical. So, you know, so there is that nuanced discussion about black and white, which doesn't work because, you know, these are the base building blocks that we've built our society on.
To give you an example, I was doing a keynote for Field Turf Congress in the Netherlands. And I did some research, and somewhere I found an article about a biopolymer derived from fossil fuels. They can make them, but they've decided not to.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, you know, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah,
but yeah. So one of the things that it comes down to is that we have a huge amount of opportunity that is beneficial, that is beautiful, that's inspiring, that's great, that is actually has good business models, if we want to do it.
Yeah.
And it starts in, basically, it most often starts in the boardroom of medium-sized companies. Medium-sized companies are fast enough to move and have enough decision-making power that they don't just need to cater to the average opinion of the global population, but can actually make some more tangible, some more forward-thinking.
And they tend to have, what do you call that? Slow finance, slow investors. Or you call it investors who are willing to take their time.
Yeah, long-term horizon perspective, and that's really kind of required. The thing is, we have come at a point in human development at this moment where the long-term that we're talking about when we're talking about these kinds of investments are short-term enough that they're getting very close to the traditional short-term line of thing. The short-term investment line is usually 5 to 7 or 8 years, right? We're getting to that point.
Interesting.
We're getting to the point where you can do an investment today on some kind of whatever real estate project, which used to be safe. Why did people invest in real estate? Because it was safe. You're not making a 200 or 300% margin on real estate. Maybe 20% on a good day, right? But it is very safe. So you can just put all your capital into it and you're getting 12 to 15%. Fantastic. Really great. Keep doing it.
Better than a bank account, yeah.
Yeah, but it is no longer the case. It is just simply no longer safe. There are whole neighborhoods being developed, even here in the Netherlands, that are outdated by the time the first resident moves in, that are not tuned to how society will be operating within 20 or 30 years, not within 70 or 80 or 100, no, within half of a single generation. So a young family that moves in may within 10 or 15 years
move out.
Well, either move out or be required to invest heavily into upgrading, altering their situation. Yeah. The whole composition of that neighborhood may change in terms of demographics, the mobility solutions that are implemented and how they're structured to make use of that, the diversity of program that's often faltering. I see whole neighborhoods being built, even here in the Netherlands, they don't even have a shop. Yeah. I mean, it's insane. So everyone needs to have some kind of mechanized form of transport to just, buy a block of cheese. And, the Dutch, if they don't have a block of cheese, it's panic. So we need to go out and get on our electric motorbike, electric bicycle, electric whatever it is. If
you cannot walk to the shop.
If we cannot walk to the shop. And these are such fundamental basics. And, they're easy to implement within new. And so this is surface level on that.
Yeah.
And if you understand it within the complexity and depth of designing a neighborhood, there are many, many, many more of these, and they all add up together. And
is this the same thing as you mentioned that what we said about the dismantling of governmental organizations with people who have vision?
100%. Governments don't know how to ask for the plans that would actually result into a resilient, sustainable neighborhood.
Because
they don't know how to ask or judge it.
Because if you go back to the past where we had really famous urban planners which have their still have their legacy. They had a vision of how a neighborhood or how a big part of the city should grow. Are you suggesting that we're lacking these kind of personalities now in urban planning, also from a governmental point of view, like a municipality?
Completely. So
that's scary shit.
I mean, most big cities in the Western world have deconstructed their planning department to be very bare bones. They don't make the urban plans themselves. They
outsource it.
They outsource it. And the thing is, there's nothing inherently wrong with that from, let's say, an ethics perspective or something. But there is something wrong with it from a knowledge retention perspective. So
and ownership.
Ownership. And there are many great people working in these departments, but they're working their behinds off, and they have far more work than they could possibly handle. The budgets are way too small. I mean, I see that, for example, being involved in several parts of new developments in the city of Almere. And it's just unbelievable how that process goes and how decisions are made. And I mean, it's basically like that everywhere. The budgets are not there. And if they are there, and in the rare circumstance that a proper market consultation is kind of written out for those experts to come in, then they don't know how to write the question and they don't know how to evaluate those that apply. So you typically see that those that have the prettiest pictures wins. And that's very flattened. Yeah. It's not entirely true in that, sure, they're looking at other things as well, but they're definitely not looking at the long-term resilience and climate adaptability and they don't have a frame of reference for it either. And then they try to pour it into hundreds of individual little rules and little questions that then and it's very difficult. I mean, so you're basically probing the level of knowledge and expertise of an expert that you need because you don't know how to do it.
And so you're asking the wrong question.
You're asking the wrong question. And so, I have a colleague, I won't mention his name, but he's a famous Dutch architect that's renowned for sustainable development. And he's getting these days, I mean, let's say 20 years ago, you know, it was a project that would ask for high sustainability performance. And if he would sign up, he would have a very high chance, if not have the chance, to win that assignment. But nowadays, he loses against companies that literally have never ever done that, just because they, write the proposal in a certain way. And the jury has basically no clue. So they're just going to have to kind of judge on something. And you can't evaluate between that because they're not an expert. And so this unraveling of the government institutions, the planning agencies, is...
Is that also what you want to achieve with Orchid City?
Yeah, I mean, we want to use it. I mean, we're doing it twofold. One, we're using it as a signpost for people to understand that this is actually possible.
Yeah.
You can have an affordable, financially profitable for the developer, realistic, can be built today
as
within the
canvas, yeah.
As a canvas on which to have a great place to live that ticks all the boxes, right? But on the one hand, of course, we would love to develop one. So we are looking for developers and investors to collaborate to find a location and build one. That's the long game. That's our long-term kind of strategy. And we're collecting partners now. And that's kind of a big international thing. So that's worldwide. Then on the other hand, we are advisors that can help, let's say, a city government figure out how far they could go with asking for a sustainable city design to the market. So we then partner up with the municipality and help them write the question. We can also be the ones that sit on the other side of the table and apply for the tender. But the thing is, we haven't seen a tender that would give us the confidence that they actually know what they're talking about and that this would win. Because we've applied to plenty of them, and it'd be thrown out of the window against a plan where you go like, okay, it looks nice.
It's ticking the box, but
it's not actually performing the way that they had hoped it to be. So that's why we side with the side of asking the right question, and that's quite fundamental. And I think that you could conjure up setting up a national framework for that, so that you can build on each other's knowledge in order for those questions to become better. But this whole tender mechanism, I mean, in the world of architecture and urban planning, it's a huge pain. And what's even worse is if I tell you, if you're not in that world, that many of these projects start with a competition. So that means that the city or developer writes out a competition on which anywhere between 10 or 50 or something companies, they invest in that. They get nothing.
And they invest time, but they get no cash.
They get no cash unless they win. Now, if you want to have a formula for having low quality work that is trying to sell itself in the best way possible, that's the formula. If you want to have a formula where people are underpaid, where interns from China are sleeping underneath their desk in order to make the work, that's the formula. And that's what, in large parts of the world, including the Netherlands, is very much reality. So these competitions are almost invariably won by the same 5 to 7 architecture firms in the Netherlands. Many of them are architecture firms that just decided to do urban planning as well, even though they are totally different professions, totally different ways
of thinking,
looking at the world, of conceptualizing what, how mankind manifests the world around them. But okay. And then they're very good at writing those tenders. And they have, it's almost like a machine, and they win one after another. And then you see them popping up left and right. And then, they look funky. And we're very good in the Netherlands at making things look funky.
Yeah, but functional is a totally different idea.
And so the more thorough understanding, and I see that in most other countries, that there's a more thorough understanding of that process. Even, let's say, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, you see more thoroughly developed, more thoroughly thought through projects arise, but they're also struggling with this tender cycle. And that's why we are hoping to also work with developers directly, because that's the source of the investment capital. And if you are able to form the developer and the investment capital, then you can try to see where in the world there would be the opportunity and the freedom to develop something like this. And once 2 or 3 of them exist, you will see that they will perform.
You first need your prototype, and then everybody can shoot at it, and then you do another one, and then another one, and then it becomes business as usual.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, for sure.
One last question, because that's also part of my curiosity, and then we're going to conclude. 2 questions, was it? First of all, with reporting, you also have an opinion on ESGs and CSRD and SDGs.
Yeah, sure.
And what I see, and I had a conversation with the network of r3o.org with Bill and I always forget his second name. Bill and Ralph, that they see that these reporting standards are being used as compliance, ticking in the box. You now have AI just doing the reporting for you. And I can also assume that from an architectural and urban planning perspective, and also industrial metabolism, which we didn't touch, but the companies are looking into supply chain and see what they can do better. And then this reporting is a part of that. What is your opinion on that, and where can it be that it goes beyond compliance and it actually has a function, not just as pleasing investors?
Yeah. So that's a very, very important broader appeal question, I'd say. So Accept Integrated Sustainability is a sustainability consulting strategy and design firm. So half of our work is advising companies on their sustainability strategy. We make a very strong distinction between sustainability strategy and ESG strategy. When we started our work, there was neither of them, but the ESG and their associated reporting and frameworks and certifications and standard settings and so on have bloomed in the last 20 years.
It's a big maze of how many there are.
And to a large degree, I fully agree with Bill and Ralph on their perspective on this. My choice has been for a long time already to not work on that. So it's odd, like people find it increasingly odd that as a sustainability consultancy, we don't make ESG reports. We just don't. And I have a very clear answer to that. That's the domain of accountants.
Yeah.
An ESG report will show the world to some degree, or at least the intent of it to show the world with some level of transparency and standardization, what your organization is doing.
Has been doing. Yeah.
Has been doing. And that's it.
Yeah.
It doesn't improve any of it.
True.
The idea being that if you shine a light on it, there may be a focus on trying to make it better. Well, I like that idea, but it's very secondhand and it's very indirect. And the structures and frameworks are complex enough that they can completely distract you from figuring out what are we actually going to do to make things better.
Yeah.
And so for us, a sustainability strategy is working together with an organization for everyone involved to get a very clear picture of how that organization actually has influence on and is influenced by society as a whole. And to figure out how the organization can be used as a means to transition the society or the areas of society that it influences towards a more sustainable state. And by doing so, nestle itself into being invaluable, absolutely critically valued in that transition and being able to derive value from it. And by doing that, the company becomes more resilient because it is needed. It is part of the transition.
Yeah, it becomes future fit and more investor-like
Yes.
and everything. Yeah.
And so just to say, that's a very broad of overall strategy. And that starts with kind of working together and looking at a lot of different aspects, which is also what this, the framework of symbiosis in design development is helping to do, is a step-by-step procedure in which you do that intelligence gathering, systems analysis, and then with everyone around the table with their eyes open, helping to determine a long-term development roadmap for the organization to be both opportunistic in the now and the here and get the most out of what they're doing, as well as moving towards a dot on the horizon in which we're all part of a sustainable reality.
And including the appetite of their investors and everything.
Everything. So it becomes the strategy of an organization. Yeah. So you walk into the door of sustainability, but it's the sustainability of the organization versus the sustainability of the world. And in the end, an organization wants to be sustainable. They want to be resilient. They want to be profitable. So that's what you're working on, but you're doing that by making them an intrinsic part of the need of society to go into that transition trajectory. Now, ESG reporting is simply a very small, not unimportant, but a very small part of this, in which you show to the world what you have been doing, where your impacts lie. And it's important for compliance and things like that. But basically nothing more than that. I know companies that are basically doing a terrible job that have great ESG reports, and I know companies doing a great job that don't have one at all. And so there is no real correlation between these things. Something that is worth noting here is that the accountancies of this world, let's just throw them all on one heap, but it's also the big four that have a big contribution to this. So I don't know the exact figures, but something that I read was that Deloitte or something had pumped in 300 million per year into setting up their worldwide ESG systems. They need to make their money back. And why did they do that? Because traditional accountancy is just dead. I mean, all the automated computer systems are doing the vast majority of what an accountant used to do. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they need to find a new thing that they, with their abilities, which is numbers, checking reports, doing audits and things like that, which is valuable. But where to apply it to? Well, here's a new thing, ESG reports, which is pretty much exactly what they are good at. So they invest in it. And with that comes a huge marketing machine that goes on every conference all around the world talking about the importance and the necessity of ESG compliance. And then, the investors start asking for it, and then the companies are basically required to do it, and everyone's on the bandwagon. And before you know it, many people think that working on ESG is working on sustainability. Yeah. But it's not.
And that's the perception.
It's kind of like, saying that you're, working to win a car race while you're, working on child seed production. They are somewhat associated and related to each other, but not closely. And so, the companies that are really making headway in being truly a contributor towards the sustainability transition. You see them doing really well in the market. One of them is a client of ours, Pizza 4Ps. It's a pizza chain in Southeast Asia that's been booming because they are doing it from a set of intrinsic values and a strategy associated with it that within the very tough food and beverage business, restaurant business, are just, they can't open restaurants fast enough. And in a highly competitive atmosphere, because everyone notices it from the front door to the very end of your visit, and everything you're associated, they are walking the talk and are being transparent about it. And they only started doing ESG reports a few years back. And so, we're supporting them a little bit in making a headway with that, but their fundamental strategy, what's their long-term plan, that was the real thing that we engaged with them with.
Yeah, and that's also what Bill and Ralph mentioned, that it measures the past.
Yes.
And you can do the past every year, and then people have the idea that you're progressing,
Yeah.
but it doesn't measure your progress with the last 10 years.
It doesn't. And what Bill and Rolf are very much advocates for, which I fully agree with, is that the current way that the ESG frameworks are, especially the default ones, the GRI and CSRD, that the way that they're currently with double materiality and so on, they don't even make much sense. They are not related to the needs of the planet and society. So therefore, they measure something, but it's
what are they measuring?
Meaningless.
Yeah.
So if you use the SBTI or better the UNRSID as a goal-setting system, then that would be much better, because that's trying to tie to. But in the very end, for us, that's still part of that pie of ESG, and saying, why don't you figure out how you can actually act in order to help the transition to a sustainable society from the strength of your organization.
Yeah, once your strategy is clear, transparent, future fit, then you're already compliant, because everybody sees what you're doing and you're investable. And you don't have to tick in all the boxes, because you're already writing it down.
I mean, once you're doing that, making an ESG report is so much easier. Yeah. And so I'm working with quite a few very small companies that have to make a decision, right? Are we going to make an ESG report or not? And it will cost them, $60 to $100 to $200,000 or euros per year.
It's ridiculous.
It's very high, very expensive. And there is an absolute vested interest for the big accountancies to make this as complicated as possible.
Jesus.
So there are helpful tools out there online that will help you streamline making ESG reports and so on. So I always advise to really use them, but to be very aware of that. It simply doesn't help your organization become part of a sustainable world, improves in sustainable impact. No, you need a sustainability strategy.
It's basically like having your annual audit from your accountant, and you suddenly have to buy a second accountant.
Yes.
Just to audit something that nobody really looks like.
Precisely that.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. And so that's why we wrote Symbiosis in Development, because it's a step-by-step framework to help you develop a sustainability strategy. There is nothing about ESG in there except for
but it's good.
An appendix that kind of defines some terms.
No, because that is very similar to what I'm noticing with my clients.
Yeah.
If your strategy is clear, ticking the boxes becomes easy.
Yes.
If you don't have a clear strategy, you have to work around, and if you talk about the elephants, ticking in the boxes is much easier. If you don't talk about the elephants, you need to write a lot of words.
True, and something that we usually start with in the beginning of such a trajectory with a company is a training cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Is to assemble a team inside of the organization with a representative of each major department, and then go through a 3 to 6 month training that isn't only training, that's also already trying to prime the minds in order to start making a long-term strategy together. And that is so important, because you need to first speak the same language. If you and I are talking about sustainability and we're using that word, but we understand something fundamentally different with it, we're never going to agree. And we may be actually talking about the same thing, but you get endless discussions on terminology and definitions. And it is so useful to be able to use a vocabulary and the tools of people that have come before and have already run those races. Because who wants to get lost in the forest of misunderstanding? So the training and priming, almost as we say, is really important for creating the capacity inside of an organization to start developing this long-term strategy. And it cannot just be done by people in the boardroom. Can't. You have to have people on the floor participate in that process. So it's very enjoyable. It also actually doubles as team building exercises and things like that. So it's usually quite efficient, but it is quite a thing. You have to go through a single year cycle to set it all up, do all the training, and then go through the initial roadmap definition cycle and so on until you have what we call the train, and the train every year repeats itself to just adjust the long-term roadmap and get the feedback again. And within that cycle, you can integrate an ESG reporting cycle, but you don't have to. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the conversation, Tom.
Thank you so much, Alex.
I'm pleased you took time to listen to the whole episode. Why not consider joining my Patreon to support me in creating more of these conversations? Or even rate my podcast in your favorite podcast app. Thank you again for listening, and join me next time.